Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're continuing our Kupala Lore-hunt with a very intriguing book. Dare I say, a book that changes everything when it comes to the relation between Kupala, the Tzimisce, and the Tremere, especially if we consider the sources we've already gone through. This book is House of Tremere for Dark Ages Vampire, released in 2000. Immediately what needs to be said is that it contains a lot of amazing details about important characters who stand at the very foundation of the sects we know in the modern Knights, and that is very interesting. It adds meaningful details and impressive character portraits to vampire history, thus it is a great supplement to have when running games for the more research and historically minded player character, lore seekers and noddist scholars. But I am officially adding this one to my list of difficult reads that make me physically uneasy because of the absolute horrors that are Tremere experiments. I'm adding this next to the Bali Clan book and the book Earthbound, which is not to say they aren't well written. What I'm saying is they are difficult reads, at least for me, because they make me physically ill due to their grotesque and graphic content, so read them at your own peril. The Tremere at this point in history, having none of the traditions that other clans have as vampires, having no rules of hospitality or other things of the like, they are more cruel than the Tzimisce, if you can believe that, and I do have a quote from the very first pages of the book. Bogdan had seen many awful sights among the flesh-crafted victims of the Tzimisce, which these creatures at first sight resembled. The creatures in the cages were different in some way Bogdan didn't have the words for. They were ill-fitted patchworks born out of a colder kind of madness than the Tzimisce's. Know that I also have no words, nor do I intend to describe the experiments of the Tremere, but it is important that you know this Bogdan character was at some point tortured by the Tzimisce and actually suffers worse at the hands of the Tremere. But why is any of this important to our lore hunt? Because the traits of the Tremere make them perfect candidates to be manipulated by Kupala and help spread his taint, which, you guessed it, they were and they did. Before we go into that though, allow me to sum up a few more events in the history of the Tremere as presented by one of their own in this book, one who was sacrificed gruesomely as part of the ritual to consecrate the grounds on which the chantry of Cheoris was erected. And I quote, "We were magi, wonder workers whose mastery of sorcery's secrets allowed us transcendence over the laws of nature, including the aging of our own bodies. Leading us was a tall man with coal-black eyes, Tremere, head of our house, who once nearly became absolute ruler of all of Europe's magi. To each side of him were his closest aides, fervid Goratrix and cautious Etrius. Across from him stood placid, consoling Mirlinda. Completing the circle of 7 were Arundinis, whose doom would come before the next century, Anguissa, who would not survive another spring, and Ponticulus, who had but minutes to live." End quote. Ponticulus is sacrificed to consecrate the grounds, and his severed head is buried into the earth. Sometime later, before the chantry is constructed on site, the following event happens, and I quote, "There was supposed to be a fresh sapling growing on the spot where they'd buried my head. I surprised them. I savored the looks of shock and anger on their faces. I was a great oak-like thing with writhing oily leaves. They drew closer and saw etched in its bark my mocking features. I opened my newly grown mouth, drooling sap, and warned them that they did the bidding of a thing none of them knew. I felt the beings, stars above and root of all, clawing through my dark roots. I was about to name them when Goratrix set the tree alight with a spell." End quote. And that is how Ponticulus dies again, and not for the final time either. So what are these beings he mentioned? A helpful little sidebar explains, and I quote, "Throughout House of Tremere, there is mention of two powerful and enigmatic spiritual beings, Root of All and Stars Above. They are invoked at the foundation of Choris. They contact various magi throughout the centuries, encouraging betrayal and lust for power. An image emerges of these beings manipulating the proud magi towards their damnation. The nature of these entities is purposefully left ambiguous. The easiest and most canonical answer is that Root of All is the demon Kupala, and that Stars Above is the antediluvian Solot, each pushing the Tremere towards vampirism and the world towards Gehenna for their own reasons." Okay, so now we know that very much like the Tzimisce, the Tremere were also influenced by Kupala. But what happens next? The book tells us that after the construction of Choris was complete, which took 5 years, Goratrix and Etrius killed the builders who had seen too much and lied to more sensitive magi of the house that the builders' memories were wiped and they'd returned home with sacks full of gold. Oh boy. Now, what's interesting is that the majority of inhabitants of Choris consists of servants and other less powerful mortal magi. Unlike the Tzimisce, which are fiercely territorial, isolated, and have plenty of difficulty traveling, the Tremere are open and move around quite a bit, as shown in the fact that in 997, Choris hosted a grand conclave of Tremere magi who came from as far as England and Jerusalem, after Etrius found indisputable proof that the chantry's vis was diminishing in 996. So magic was indeed dying, and magi could no longer sustain their immortality, and I quote, "Some force they did not understand was slowly stripping from them their sense of control over existence." Though Tremere forbade diabolism at first, not on moral grounds, but because it wasn't as effective as they'd hoped, since any demon who was weak enough to be bound was effectively useless, and the powerful ones would be effective but impossible to control, Etrius reasoned that the power of diabolic worship lies not in the demon's power, but in the repetition of ritual demands, and with that, he got Tremere to approve of his studies, and this I have to quote, "After seeing poor results from the sacrifice of pigs and chickens, he sent retainers out into the countryside to seize the virginal daughters of farmers and foresters. He sacrificed over 24 young women over his 2 decades of research. Etrius repeated his experiments with newborn babes as sacrificial subjects to no better effect. Sometimes he summoned demons unintentionally. Sometimes he got nothing but a few foul smells for his trouble." Well, in 1003, Etrius actually manages to summon 3 demons from the pit, which result in the death of 2 magi, 4 apprentices, and half a dozen retainers, before he manages to expel the demons back to hell. After decades of failed research, desperation started setting in, and at this point House Tremere was delving into practices that would have been found unacceptable to the Order of Hermes had the Order known of such practices, which they did not. It was Goratrix who had the breakthrough, and I quote, "He contacted at least 2 different entities who provided him with crucial instructions. Having been the World Tree of Choris, I recognized them as Root of All and Stars Beyond, the beings who had filled my roots with hate." Goratrix's inquiries continued for another 11 years. End quote. And it needs to be said that these instructions were so complex, they covered more than 1,000 leaves of parchment, and performing the ritual took 7 sleepless days and nights. Some of the participants were Tremere, Etrius, Goratrix, and Mirlinda, 2 of which, Etrius and Mirlinda, are still on the inner council of 7 during the modern Knights. They are the highest ranking members of the pyramid, and if not themselves, then one or more of their progeny is in the Camarilla's inner circle, appointing Justicars and deciding the fate of their sect. So if you thought the Camarilla, unlike the Sabbat, is diabolism-free, as did I, well, I guess we were wrong. But what's truly interesting here is the fact that Kupala, the root of all, is no longer just that, air quotes, Tzimisce demon thing who is worshipped by the Koldun, end air quotes, but sits at the foundation of both sects, the Sabbat and the Camarilla. It influenced the Sabbat through ritual, through the Vauldery or other forms of drinking blood, and through the Tzimisce, of course. The Camarilla it influences through House Tremere, who became Clan Tremere after, get this, consuming the blood of the Tzimisce, since that was a key ingredient in them becoming vampires, and this is one of the strongest clans of the Camarilla. So I think it's the perfect time for a quote. Kupala, a devil of ancient origin, has suffused the lands of Transylvania and surrounding countries with its dark aura. It feeds on pride and lust for power, encouraging dark magical workings and other dread deeds, and slowly turning practitioners to its ways. The Magi of House Tremere, so full of pride and hunger, are ideal candidates. Now this is how Kupala works. Subtly, effectively, it doesn't need to reveal itself in any fancy way, but simply controls and works through others, even when turning its own pawns against one another to feed on more suffering and more destruction. The Omen War, the war between Clan Tremere and Clan Tzimisce, in light of the information presented in this book, can be considered a machination of Kupala. The gargoyle creations of the Tremere are beginning to look a lot like another, more potent and magical form of Schlachta. These new Tzimisce, which were uncursed, created without soil dependency, and led by the absolute greed and ambition that is Tremere, would be the perfect ones to spread Kupala's corruption all over Europe. But did they? Yes, they did. In the Shadows of Choris chapter, the book tells us about the intrigues within the Tremere chantry in Durham, called the Sleeping Lion. During her extended stay at Choris, the mage Ero interacted with a being who identified itself as Stars Beyond, but eventually encouraged her to call it Kupala. She returned to Durham, her home chantry, where she built a small shrine to this entity and manipulated another 6 mages into dedicated worship of this demon, and it is here that I quote, "The small patch of forest surrounding the shrine has become increasingly bleak and oddly reminiscent of the Transylvanian landscape. 4 times a year, Ero and her cabal secretly travel there to make offerings to Kupala. He has recently begun to demand human sacrifices. Ero satisfies him by hiring thieves to kidnap street urchins for her." That being read, whether bound in Transylvania or not, Kupala is doing just fine, both before and after the Tremere became a clan, slowly moving the world towards Gehenna, having manipulated various individuals, vampires, mages, or simple mortals, all over Europe and all the way into the British Isles. Now let me tell you the punchline. On page 129, you will find a helpful little sidebar that says the following, and I quote, "It's a great testament to Tremere hubris that they would ever think that magic was dying. Magic is not a quantifiable property that can vanish or grow. It is a conception of some of the larger and changing forces of creation. Nothing was, or is, dying. The world was simply changing, as it always had. But the Tremere could not see that then, and cannot see it now. The same systematic, dogmatic approach to magic that enabled them to grow and prosper as a grand house also prevents them from understanding that a change is afoot. So there we have it. Kupala played not only the Tzimisce, but the Tremere, and quite a few other clans into doing its bidding. Whether bound by the geomantic web or not, the root of all is ridiculously effective at influencing and corrupting everything it touches. There is no fear, ambition, or curiosity that it can't manipulate, and in doing so, makes sure that the disease is passed on. At their roots, the Tremere, as a House of the Order of Hermes turned into a vampire clan, are diabolist, diablerist, sadists, and liars. And some of the very same kindred, I will call them, who were there in Chaoris, are now the highest ranking decision makers of the Tremere and the Camarilla, such as Etrius and Mirlinda. The ones all other Tremere are blood-bound to serve. And on that horrifying note, now that you and I fully understand why the Tremere are a clan to be regarded with suspicion, distrusted, and feared, I thank you very much for listening. We will continue the lore hunt with the 2001 revised Tzimisce clan book. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play wisely.